Good afternoon and welcome to today's Thought Leader Roundtable, a conversation on readiness. Today's session is a part of a regular series of explorations of the key questions of what does it mean for all young people to be ready for life's demands at every stage, and what is it going to take to get there? Karen Pittman, CEO of the Forum for Youth Investment, leads lively and candid conversations with some of the most influential, boundary-pushing leaders working to improve the lives of children and young people in the U.S. Today's session will feature Camille Farrington with the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research. The conversation will focus on the Foundations for Young Adult Success framework. We'd like to thank the Wallace Foundation for making today's conversation possible. A little bit about our two presenters today. Karen Pittman is President and CEO of the Forum for Youth Investment and a respected sociologist and leader in youth development. Prior to co-founding the Forum in 1998, she launched adolescent pregnancy prevention initiatives at the Children's Defense Fund, started the Center for Youth Development and Policy Research, and served as Senior Vice President at the International Youth Foundation. Camille Farrington is a Senior Research Associate at the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research. Her work focuses on the policy and practice in urban high school reform, particularly classroom instruction and assessment, academic rigor, and academic failure. Dr. Farrington is a national expert on the role of non-cognitive factors in academic performance. There are only a few slides, actually 2 slides for today's session. We'll be accepting questions and comments via the chat feature, which is available at the top of your screen. Today's session is being recorded and it will be provided to you later this week, as well as for anyone else who's registered, and will be posted to the Ready by 21 website, along with any additional resources that are mentioned. If you'd like to tweet about today's session, we have a hashtag, and that hashtag is ReadyYouth. So please feel free to follow along with the Twitter conversation. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Karen.
Thanks, Ian. I am really excited. Camille knows, and by the end of this call, you all will know that not only is Camille one of my favorite people, the framework that the UChicago Consortium has created around young adult success is by far one of the ones that I think is the most accessible and comprehensive and important. And I use it regularly and have for the past couple of years in all the presentations that I give. So I'm excited that we finally gotten our schedules to connect, and we have an hour to really learn more about the framework, how it was created and how it's being used, and even hear a little bit more about what's coming next. So with that, let me just kick off by asking Camille to tell us a little bit about the University of Chicago Consortium and what you do there. So give us a little bit of background.
Okay, sounds good. Well, thanks, Karen, and thanks so much for inviting me today. So the UChicago Consortium is a 26-year-old research center at the University of Chicago, and it is one of the original place-based research centers. So almost all of our work focuses on the Chicago public schools and in really dedicated to building the capacity for school reform by conducting research that identifies what matters for student success and for school improvement, and how to improve educational outcomes for kids. And so my work at the consortium is a little different than the kind of central mission of the consortium, in that we really, my team, which is the learning and development team here, has more of a national focus to our work. So our work is our interests are in schools, and particularly high schools, and we're really interested in thinking of them as developmental spaces. So we think about how kids experience learning environments and experience themselves in those settings, and how those psychological experiences impact their learning and development. And then, what are the implications for adults in those settings to kind of take seriously the development as well as the learning of young people.
That's great. So in a second, I'll sort of harken back to some earlier efforts that have happened to really sort of come up with this broad framing, but give us a little bit of background on how the decision and probably how the funding to put this wonderful framing piece together came about.
Sure, yeah. So in 2012, we had done some previous work and put out a report called Teaching Adolescents to Become Learners. And that included a framework for illustrating the role of quote unquote, non-cognitive factors in shaping students' school performance. And in that report and that framework, we did a really deep review of the literature, and we tried to from that, kind of shift folks from thinking about social, emotional, or non-cognitive factors as things that kids like lacked or needed to develop. And instead, we were really trying to emphasize that, the students' behaviors and school performance were driven in large part by their mindsets, by their attitudes and beliefs in school, and particularly things like feelings of belonging and relevance and self-efficacy and growth mindset. And that, those in turn were influenced by classrooms and school environments. So all of that work was very school focused, though. We were trying to understand school performance. And then in 2013, the Wallace Foundation put out an RFP for a new project. And they were focused on, attitudes and skills and character traits that contribute to a young person's long-term success. And they were looking for somebody to kind of synthesize the research on, what mattered and create some kind of conceptual framework that addressed how students would develop those factors. And, our earlier work had that real school focus, but we were increasingly interested in kind of going beyond that and thinking more broadly about young people's development. And so my colleagues here at the consortium, Jenny Nagaoka and Stacy Ehrlich, and I submitted a proposal. Jenny's expertise was in the transition to college. Stacy's expertise was in early childhood, and mine was in adolescence. And then we also brought on Ryan Heath, who was an out-of-school time expert. And so we had a really strong kind of developmental aspect to our team. And so luckily we won that contract. And then over the next year and a half, from end of 2013 through the summer of 2015, we were engaging with this project, and it really, with the generous support and thought partnership with the Wallace Foundation. So that was how that happened.
That's great, and I'm so glad that it did. I think probably a lot of folks on the phone are familiar with the framework, but I have up on the screen, or Ian has up on the screen right now, a slide that I use to really sort of explain in the historical context why I think this framework is so important and represents really an update to the seminal work that was done back in 2002. The National Research Council report, Community Programs that Promote Youth Development, did two great things that really helped galvanize the field. Like you, they looked at K-12 settings, at community youth development settings, and even looked at some of the family research to try to figure out, first, what are the characteristics of good developmental settings where kids grow up? And those were things like safety and support and engagement and belonging, the things that you just mentioned. And then the second thing that they asked was the question of what are the domains that predict adult success? And on the screen, you'll see that a lot of those specific things that we now talk about as social emotional skills or non-cognitive skills or life skills or whatever were highlighted back then in 2002. These are not new things. But the value of what you all have done in really putting that sort of litany of skills, and we often sort of get caught in the quagmire of which list of skills is the list that we should use and how should you sort of sort them and group them, putting that into really sort of a developmental framework that starts with this broad definition of what are the key factors that define youth success. Those ideas, which you're going to talk about in a minute, of agency, a sense of integrated identity and competencies, and then that those, as you just said, really are developed because young people have both the self-regulation skills that they need, they've got the mindsets, knowledge and skills that they're building to have a range of competencies. And what I love about the frame is that you've really just explicitly added in this idea of values and not lumped it in with the others. And then the final piece, which brings the whole environment piece together, is that you say inside of all that, young people build those skills through this combination of action and reflection. And when I take this out and use it with communities and with schools, just the reality of those concrete verbs that describe what action and reflection mean turn out to be very valuable conversation starters and very valuable ways for people to really assess whether they're creating the kind of learning environments wherever they are where young people can live. So I find it an incredibly useful and compact way to get across a lot of information about this basic idea that since learning really is social and emotional, context matters, not just the content, but context matters, and that we need to spend a lot more time thinking about how we as adults can intentionally really improve the context and make sure that we're creating those developmental relationships and developmental conditions. So that's my 2-minute plug for, and anybody on the phone, I'm happy to share my version of the slides. Camille will share hers as well, and she's going to dig in more detail. But I just wanted to make sure that folks on the phone understood as we go into more detail why here at the forum we're so excited and grateful that you really created, you sort of come up out of the muck and created this broad developmental framework. So let's sort of dig in and get started. And why don't we sort of start at the big space, which is, why did you start with the idea of young adult success when so many people are starting with specific definitions of skills and competencies?
Mm-hmm. Well, part of that was driven by the Wallace Foundation's goals for the project, because they started off being focused on this idea of young adult success. Or actually, I have to say that their initial RFP was focused on college and career success. And so our first step was really to, I'm kind of a backwards mapping kind of gal. My inclination is to start with the end in mind. So we started to dig in to say, well, what contributes most to success in college and career? But, as we began, we did two things in this project. We both did a really kind of deep and broad literature review, but we also interviewed a lot, hundreds of experts. And as we started doing these expert interviews, and, we were talking to people in higher ed and workforce training programs and youth development, also to parents. And what we quickly realized is that most people who work with young people or who love and raise young people, they're concerned with a much broader range of outcomes than just college and career success. They want to raise or support kids that are healthy and happy and who can create stable families and navigate social institutions and, advocate for themselves and their loved ones, who can, maintain their own health and vitality and contribute to collective enterprises and all of those kinds of things. And so quickly we thought college and career success just doesn't really capture that. And so we expanded that definition to this broader idea of young adult success, and that included all of these domains. And, we wanted to know kind of what competencies or other factors really allowed young people to successfully do all of that.
That's great, and I think it's a phrase. While college and career success is important and readiness is out there, I think this general phrase of young adult success fits well into just the overall developmental arc that also is sometimes missing when we just talk about skills. Mm-hmm. The idea of really, how does this grow over time? You're naming an end state, which is young adulthood, and defining backwards from that. So talk a little bit about how you ended up with those key factors as you went through the research. How did you land on competencies, identity? How did you get there, and agency?
Yeah, so again, I think we wanted to start with the end in mind. So we were, kind of what are the three things that any teacher or parent or youth worker should hold as their kind of North Star when they're working with young people? And we kept coming back to three main things. We want to raise children and youth who grow up to be competent, meaning that they have socially valued skills, and who have a sense of agency and are able to kind of pursue their own goals and purposes and use those skills to ends that they care about. And then also this idea of an integrated identity. And here we were really thinking about the many social identities that each of us brings to our lives. And, that can be membership in particular social groups. So being African-American, or being a girl, or coming from Central America, or being, transgender, or whatever various configurations of social identity we bring, that those social identities should not be at odds with our intellectual identities, professional identities, or the identities as loving, caring, capable people. And so, we want young people who don't have to be at war with themselves to be in particular contexts. So we felt that like competencies, agency, and integrated identity represented the kind of three critical ideas that really captured what we ultimately cared about as we kind of set young people forth into their lives.
Yeah, that's great. I think a couple of months ago we had Beverly Daniel Tatum on the phone with us talking about her book, the 20th anniversary, and sort of re-edition of her book, Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria? And integrated identity is one of the themes that's very important in there, and a theme that's particularly challenging to do if you happen to be a young person of color or in any way sort of different from the norm. So I think it's important, and I've had people sort of ask the question, why the word integrated? And so I think you've just done a nice job of explaining both why it's important to get to an integrated identity, and then the fact that sometimes this is more challenging for some young people than others to get to that integrated identity when there really are sort of differences in how you're seen and approached depending on which context you're in.
Absolutely.
So as you sort of back up from that, those sort of three ideas of competencies, agency, and identity, which clearly, again, resonate with lots of folks, including young people. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you've used it, but we've used this in very mixed settings in which we sort of share this with young people themselves. And they very much appreciate both the acknowledgement that getting to that integrated identity is sometimes difficult, and that word agency, because often the conversation is about what are they learning, what are we pouring into them, as opposed to what are they now able to sort of pull together into, we sort of talk about their sort of abilities or competencies backpack. What are they now able to do because they have developed all these things? So those three words really resonate with folks, and we appreciate it. We're digging down into that next ring of how you got to those sort of key developmental foundations. Talk a little bit about how there's so many ways to organize these. And you mentioned sort of getting to that idea that mindsets were key. Talk a little bit about each of the four really fun foundational pieces in there, and maybe start with why you combined knowledge and skills and then pulled out the mindsets and self-regulation. Often in lists of sort of social emotional skills, you see all that sort of pulled together. What did the research sort of lead to that led you to end up with that sort of configuration?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So this project was a lot of fun and intellectually just like a really enjoyable project, because over the course of a year plus, we met on a weekly basis, and we were all of us on the research team were both reading a lot of stuff from, kind of broad range of disciplines, and then also doing these expert interviews and talking to a lot of different people. And we kept coming back, and each week we would, do another tweak on how we thought these pieces all fit together and what we ought to call them. And we have a slide deck of PowerPoint slides of about 30 different versions of this, and we could do it almost like a flip book of our developing thinking over time. But at the end of the day, we were really trying to be really intentional about making this both kind of resonant and feel true to people, but at the same time being as kind of agnostic as possible in terms of the terms and the language that we use. So at the end of the day, it was clear that there's kind of four sets of things that are different enough from each other that they warrant their own name, and that those four things are in constant interaction with each other to produce learning and development. And so we start with that self-regulation at the bottom, and we could have called that self-direction or self-management or any number of terms there. But the basic idea that, that little kids particularly can focus their attention and control their behaviors in a way that allows them to kind of show up in a space the way that that they want to show up, and that and I think that this, from a developmental perspective, we can think of, so on one hand, like the little kids can control their bodies really, and then as time goes on, to really more of a challenge to control our attention, but even for adults, if we think of, kind of setting norms for a space, and like, how do we want people to show up? What do we want them to pay attention to? And so I think that self-regulation piece is true no matter, what age we're talking about. Like, we have to be able to direct how we show up in a particular space. And then you asked about, like, why did we put knowledge and skills together? And first of all, like, that knowledge and skills piece is huge, because we're thinking really broadly there about self-knowledge and skills around the self, and then knowledge of other people and skills and strategies around interactions with other people. So things like social skills we would put in that knowledge and skills category. And then knowledge about the world, whether it's academic content knowledge or more institutional knowledge or cultural knowledge. And we put knowledge and skills together because we've thought, well, knowledge is always in the service of some kind of skill, like you use it to do something. And it's hard to separate out doing something skillfully with the knowledge of how to do it, right? So we tried to kind of parse out knowledge, skills, and strategies. And at the end of the day, we thought, all of that is pretty interconnected in a really fundamental way, and that's its own category. But again, like, I think to think really broadly about self, other, and the world in that knowledge and skills thing. And then the mindsets piece really has to do with a young person's experience and sense making around all of that. And again, it could be your experience and your sense making about yourself, like understanding, who do you think, who are you? What are your odds for success? Like all of like how connected do you feel to other people? As well as mindsets and attitudes and beliefs about other people, like, do they have my best interests at heart or not? Is the world basically a good place or a bad place? Like, all of those kinds of things really have a fundamental impact on learning and development. So that also seemed like a weighty category that needed its own name and to be called out as a really important piece. And then, truthfully, the values piece came in later, because we initially didn't have it in there, and as we were trying to get feedback and input from a lot of different people, the idea that none of this is value neutral, and there was also questions around spirituality and where does that show up, and so we wanted to add in this values piece to really talk about, like, well, what matters, what's meaningful to people, what do they value in the world, what are their priorities, and the things that they care most deeply about, and whether that's expressed in spiritual terms or in moral and ethical terms, that clearly also directs development and learning, and is one of the constituent parts of what makes people tick. And so that was how we landed on those four.
I think that's great, and at some point I'd love to see the flip book. The fact that you all took so much time as a group of researchers from diverse backgrounds and experience bases, that it's getting to this, I think is why it ends up being so useful. That the way you ended up categorizing it just makes sense from multiple perspectives. The lumping together of knowledge and skills, I think, is very consistent with the work that Learning Heroes has done, and I think we've got them coming out at some point in the near future to talk, in interviewing families about what they want their, for them, what defines, youth success. What do they want their kids to have? And that list is very much what you said. It's that list of a combination of some of these social skills, emotional skills, plus practical knowledge, plus academic knowledge. They don't differentiate them out into categories. They run it all together and say, those are the kind of skills and knowledge that I think our young people need to have in order to be successful. And similarly, on the other side, on the values side, I think when you look at some of the concerns that families have about when asked, should schools teach social and emotional skills or social and emotional learning, is they want to make sure they stay in charge of the values piece. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we're not as clear as we should be about what's being taught and what's not being taught. So pulling those out and being explicit about them, both grouping the knowledge and skills together on one side and singling out the values piece on another side, I think has been very useful when we've shared this with broader audiences. Mm-hmm. That's great. And one other thing that I think is useful, and I'll just ask you about this word, there's often this conversation about social emotional skill building and character. Do you think this frame sort of helps people that are trying to make the distinction between those two, which is bigger than the other? Does separating values out help in that definition of what character is?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So yeah, I think that, so character, people, again, like different folks have different definitions of character, and in its kind of broadest definition, it is talking about both this values piece and performance piece, like how well do you do various things. And so I would think that folks who are kind of wedded to the notion of character development and character education would again find this very resonant with the things that they think about when they think about character.
Good. Well, I know questions are coming in, so before we go to the questions, let's just do the last inside part of the graphic, which is the sort of the action and reflection piece. And even if you can just click through so we can see the specific words. Again, for me, what was useful, and explicitly because you all said this is about, it's about schools, it's about families, and it's about sort of organized activities where young people go, where learning and development might happen. The list of words of what actually happens to really get this stuff cooking has been very useful. So again, anything you want to share with us about how you got there as opposed to getting to these are the skills that teachers need to have, just keeping this in the youth conversation about how do you break down what developmental experiences look like? Any insights that you want to share on how you landed with this particular configuration of action and reflection?
Yeah, no, for sure. So this was actually one of the really big kind of aha things to me that really, hit me as we worked on this project was how little attention we pay, and particularly in schools, but how little attention we pay to what kids actually spend their time doing in the course of learning. And in, whether we're talking about schools or out of school settings, like I think most adults have been trained, particularly in schools, to think about like curriculum, instruction, and assessment, which are all described things that the teacher is doing. And in youth development programs, there could be emphasis on, program quality or staff practices, but again, perhaps less explicit attention on what the actual experiences and interactions of young people in a program, like what are they doing? What are they experiencing? And as we were really looking at the science of learning and development, and we were looking at two things, just to be really explicit. We were both looking at how are neural pathways developed in the brain, and we were also looking, so like just from a kind of neurobiological basis, how are neural pathways developed? And when we were also trying to understand from a phenomenological point of view, from the perspective of young people, like how they come to have a feeling of learning something, that they come to have a feeling of you know, something having meaning to them. Like where does that come from and what contributes to that? And so like really very diverse bodies of literature. So, you know, neurobiology on one hand and more kind of philosophical and phenomenological work on the other hand. But over and over, the same kinds of activities seemed to be coming up as being the things that supported learning and development. And so we started to just kind of catalog, well, you know, what kinds of experiences build neural pathways? What kind of experiences are associated with young people feeling like they're growing? And from that, we were able to, first of all, see that it both involved people doing stuff, so, you know, a set of action experiences, but then the critical part of then reflecting on and making meaning of what experiences they had and what actions they did. And so these verbs really came directly from the literature. And again, they would be talking about things in very different language, but they would be, you know, we tried to find just kind of really everyday language to describe really what they were talking about. So like the notion of encountering, like on one hand from a neurobiological point of view, that the brain pays attention to new things, that novelty is a really critical piece in brain development. And then we also know from young people's development, like the more opportunities that they have to try out new roles, to see new role models, to try out new kinds of behaviors, to be in a new kinds of space. Like all of that helps them to kind of make choices about who they want to be. And so we thought, okay, well, encounter is clearly an important thing. So, and it kind of, you know, evolved from there.
Yeah, it's great. And, you know, your work came out a little bit before the work that the Weikert Center, which is a part of the forum, did around preparing youth to thrive with the Student Crown Exchange. And a part of that was working with a set of organizations that really are very expert in working with young people, in this case, working with teenagers, very diverse things from boat making to teen pregnancy to youth advocacy, but folks that really were at the top of their game in terms of really figuring out how to create the right kind of context in which to deliver the content they wanted to deliver, whatever that content was, and that content really had scaffolding. But this idea of having them describe how they really created essentially a sort of a developmental curriculum that was interwoven with the content curriculum, whatever that content was that young people were doing. And these are exactly the kind of words that they use. So what I like about this, and where I think we're even trying to go in this whole conversation, like with the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development, asking any kind of professionals working with young people, teachers, youth workers, whoever, to look at a set of words like that and ask, in your 60-minute period in which you're delivering content, how can you build in time for as many of these things as possible? Mm-hmm. It turns out to be a very different way to start a conversation, because it is possible to deliver 60 minutes of content and not offer any of these opportunities.
That's absolutely true. Yes.
So I just think it's terrific. Last thing before we go to questions is you've talked a lot about how this is developmental, and so I know we have a slide in which you give us a quick sense of how these skills and competencies, getting up to that sense of agency and identity and self-identity and confidence, how they build over time. Just talk for a couple more minutes about what it meant, even though you knew your end result was young adults and sort of high school, but backing up to early childhood. How did that help really inform this whole process?
So a lot of the existing frameworks out in the world at the time we were doing this were competency frameworks, and they were quite static, saying, kids need this set of things, and the goal was just to kind of list what the competencies were. And we were really trying to put an emphasis on the developmental nature of this and the kind of fluid way in which particularly like in which adults have opportunities to influence this development at, at every single point and minute and in every context. And so we really wanted to emphasize this developmental piece. And so if we, again, kind of work backwards, we really pushed ourselves to think, first of all, are the things in these two circles, always true? Like we were looking from early childhood, like age 3 up through, 20 years old. And we're saying, is this always true? And what we found is that these things are always actively, in play, but that some are more important than others at different stages. And you can kind of think of the analogy of a plant that, in different phases or seasons, they might put more energy into their roots or into their branches or into fruit. And that if you're working with whatever the natural tendency of a particular developmental stage is, you can have the most influence on shaping young people's development. And so if you look across this slide, all of the same things are there. The only one that actually changes in terms of language is identity, because identity changes a lot from early childhood through young adulthood. And so this really kind of concrete self-concept in, ages 3 to 5, like I'm a girl, I'm a boy, and that's about it, and then more into a middle childhood, kind of the things you like, maybe, is how you would describe yourself. Anybody who hangs around middle grade students knows that group-based identity is the thing. Like, you identify yourself by your peers and the things we like and we do. And then that becomes more individuated as you move into later adolescence and high school. And then ultimately hoping into that integrated identity. But the rest of the things in the model, it's just a matter of like what they look like in a particular time and what's most important. And so we tried to show that outer ring is, getting developing over time and getting more and more and more close to its, fruition, and that within each time period, there's kind of some hot button things. So in early childhood, self-regulation and knowledge and skills, because, kids are sponges about understanding everything they possibly can about themselves, about other people, about the world. And they're learning to control their own emotions and bodies and behaviors. And then as we move into middle childhood, those things are still really prevalent. And then mindsets start to kick in this elementary school, middle childhood, but only kind of. Those come in much more strongly once you get into middle school, where mindsets are probably the most important thing going on. And then as you move into later adolescence, values are really critical, like what's fair, what is right, what do I stand for? All of that is kind of where most of the developmental energy is. And so kind of understanding this developmental arc, I think, really can help adults kind of maximize where they're putting their energy and attention in helping support young people's learning and development.
That's great. I'm looking at this, and I've looked at it a lot, but as I'm looking at it and listening to you, I've got one question before I start to read multiple questions from the listeners, and that is sort of, is there a compensatory nature to how these develop? So if in early childhood and middle childhood, for example, I'm not in contexts that really help me develop self-regulation, so I end up in middle adolescence without all of that development done. Mm-hmm. How does that affect my ability to do the other things?
Yeah, so development is always kind of mutually reinforcing. So like being strong in any one of these things helps you to develop the other things. And on the question of compensatory, it's definitely true that there are like the things that are kind of lit up in each of these different stages is really just saying this is the maximal, most efficient time for this thing to develop. Like everything is is pointing in the direction of supporting this development, and that but if you don't develop, say, self-regulation in early childhood, it's never too late to develop it later, but it will put you at a disadvantage, right, in developing these other things, and that in some cases there can be a compensatory type of thing where you're better at one thing and that makes up for something else. But generally speaking, strength in any one of these things helps to positively develop the others, and being kind of behind the curve in any of these things also tends to then put a strain on the others. And so it is this notion of kind of cascades of development, I think, is very true. But the good news is it was pretty clear that there's never a point where, oh wait, it's just too late for you on this. That there's always opportunities to kind of catch up in development on any of these things.
Great. So let's start with some of the most basic questions, which is, what's the best way for people to access the framework, the research behind the framework, you if necessary? How do people get more about what we're talking about?
Okay, so the framework itself is free, available for free download, and that includes both the big, 100-page report and then also these kind of 4-page infographic things, and that is all through the consortium.uchicago.edu website. And if you just type in that and look for Foundations for Young Adult Success, you can have access to all of those for free download. For folks who like, fancy 4-color bound copies, all of this is also available on Amazon for purchase.
Great, and we'll be sending out that link after today's session, the recording. Just wanted to mention that several people have been raising their hands. I just wanted to remind you that in order to preserve the audio for today's session, all the lines will be, besides the presenters, will be muted throughout the session. So the only way that we can receive your questions and comments will be via the chat feature. So please use that feature instead of we won't be able to make your line live in order for you to ask the question. So please use the chat feature.
Good. But we will use the next 20 minutes to really go through questions. One question, sort of speaking to some of the things we've been talking about, are there any tools or efforts that are aimed at mapping the intersection between the framework for children's youth development, social emotional learning, trauma, ACEs, strengths and assets-based educational practices? In other words, you've done a great job in talking about how all these come together. Are there other tools or frames that help people see how these various sort of approaches to working with young people integrate, and especially those that are taking into account young people who are coming out of more disadvantaged circumstances?
Mm-hmm. So there's two things I would point to. So one is there is something called the work group on, I can't even remember what it's called, social emotional competencies, but it has a fancier name than that I'm a member of, that we've been working on a set of briefs about frameworks and how best to use frameworks, how various frameworks work together, some kind of crosswalk things. And so those are actively being written and to be released in the next 6 months, maybe, coming year. And then in addition to that, a project that I'm really excited about that we're just launching now is a collaboration with CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, Emotional Learning. So, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with the CASEL wheel of social emotional competencies. So we'll be working with CASEL and the National Equity Project and then my team at the consortium to do kind of a next generation of developmental frameworks that really center on equity and address exactly some of the, whether it's trauma or whether it's just folks who are situated differently in the overall social structures of things, like how does that all play into development, and what are the considerations that adults should be taking in thinking about that. So that is a project that we're hoping to launch in the next couple of months that will not only develop a kind of next generation framework, which would be co-branded across CASEL and the Consortium and National Equity Project, and kind of freely available open source frameworks and report, but also tools and resources specifically tied to those new frameworks.
That's great. There's several questions coming in. This idea of how this sort of intersection is useful when you're dealing with young people that have experienced trauma, whether they experienced it in early childhood or later in life. So when you think about sort of those verbs that go along with action, reflection, and the kind of experiences that we want young people to have, is there anything about those that helps practitioners who are dealing with young people with trauma, it sort of helps them navigate that space better? What should they be looking out for? How do they sort of anticipate and interpret that they may be working with young people that the color of the green in those circles may not exactly match what you have in your chart? How does this help? I know you're about to do more of it, and maybe one of your issue briefs will work on it, but anything else you want to say around this issue of advice for practitioners who are dealing with young people who've experienced trauma?
Well, I think that the only thing I would add at this point, and I'll say right up front, that's an area that I'm really interested in understanding better, and that on this particular project, we did not dig into that as much as I'm looking forward to doing on this next project. So, but that being said, I think that at least keeping in mind these concentric circles helps to start to understand, well, what are the strengths and the challenges for people in these different areas. So to try and do, something of a holistic assessment, and to understand that strengths in one area can be leveraged to develop the other areas. And so, I think that's what I would say at this point, and I hope I have much more to say about that, a couple of years hence.
Good, and we look forward to it. Another question. You mentioned the idea that the competencies portion reflects socially valued competencies. How did the process that you used incorporate the values of marginalized cultures in defining competencies? How did that get built in?
Yeah, and we did not name any competencies in here, in part because of that. Like, we didn't want to superimpose, like, these are the competencies that really matter. What seemed to be important is that it's not just important that young people feel good about themselves, but that they actually have competencies and skills that allow them to realize their own potential and their own goals and purposes, or the goals and purposes of their communities. And so you need a set of competencies that people recognize as being something of value. But we very explicitly did not name what those competencies ought to be, because they could really vary from one context to the next, or from one cultural group to the next. And so, for example, there's a lot of push for example, for STEM learning, right? And science and math as being a really critical thing. And maybe science and math competencies are really critical in some contexts, absolutely true. In other contexts, they're not going to help you at all, right? So we really tried to leave it, to be fairly agnostic in terms of naming what those competencies are, but I think we could definitely put a stake in the ground to say you have to have competencies that are socially recognized and valued as being something that you have to contribute, and that helps you get where you want to go. So if you want to be an artist, then that's different than if you want to be a neuroscientist, and it might require a different set of competencies. And likewise, if you're in one culture, so, you know, we also, like, if you're on a Native American reservation, might be very different than if you're in downtown Chicago.
Excellent. And I think that leads into, there's some great questions coming in. That leads into a question of just sort of reinforcing the importance of cultural identity at the different stages of child and youth development. As you're moving up toward that integrated identity, when does cultural identity really kick in?
Mm-hmm. So on one hand, kids are absorbing lessons around race and cultural identity, you know, from the very early stages. Whether that's something that they're kind of conscious of or not is a different question, but it's something that they're absorbing from the world in which they live all the time. And where that starts becoming a conscious thing tends to be much more in adolescence. And so in adolescence, kids' racial identities are developing, their gender identities are developing, and they really start to grapple in a very conscious way with what does it mean to be this person I am, with this social identity, which includes both your racial and cultural identity, your language identity, your gender identity, your physical abilities identity, all of those things. Like, what does it mean to be this person in this world? And what are the messages that I'm getting about what that means? And how do I grapple with that? And how do I be the person that I think I am when that maybe doesn't fit with what other people think I am? And for some folks, their cultural identities are very privileged and in line with all kinds of opportunities, and there's not any disconnect for them in some kind of ways, or there's less disconnect. And for other folks, there is a ton of disconnect. And so young people face different challenges. So I think, like, across everybody, I think I feel pretty comfortable saying these are things that matter, and, like, ultimately we want to support their development. But in terms of the road to get there, there's very different sets of challenges and barriers and things to contend with along that road, depending on who you are and how you're socially situated.
Great. And again, I think that for me, I appreciate the commitment to framing what's important without over-specifying what's important, to leave room for that, you know, those differences that you just talked about. So here's someone who wants to check their assumptions. I see self-determination theory on the outside ring and experiential education in the innermost circle. Is this true?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty consistent with that at the end of the day. We spent a year and a half doing all this project, and we put this whole thing together, and then we were kind of joking with ourselves, like, here's our 108-page report and all our graphics, or you could just read John Dewey, you know? So, I think that the one thing that was both reassuring and really kind of fascinating is that a lot of the human knowledge that has developed in the last 10 or 15 years, particularly through fMRI technology and our ability to kind of look at the brain as it's doing its thing, is that a lot of these very early, Dewey, ideas of Dewey and developmental and experiential education ideas are super consistent with what we see in brain science about what really matters.
Yes, and as important as it is to recognize our roots, it's also important to update them every 10 years or so. So I'm still grateful for that, although you're right. We could all go back and reread Dewey. And maybe this will encourage people to go back and reread Dewey. I know we're getting to the last 5 minutes, and I want to give you a chance to talk about implications. So I'll give you 2 questions that sort of move into implications for practitioners and implications for policy. One question is the question that would inevitably come up of, are there ways to assess students' current level in each of these areas, and should we? And then the second question is, statement is, more and more states are recognizing that multifaceted elements of youth success in their education policies. For example, the profile of a graduate that Ed Leader 21 is advancing. What are your thoughts about this? And those, they may both factor right into your what next? What implications, what advice do you have both for practitioners and in this case for policy folks as they're thinking about this more complex definition of youth success beyond academic attainment and completion?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I love the Ed Leader 21 and the profile of a graduate work. I really strongly support that as a direction to go, because I think, again, like being clear about what we're trying to accomplish, what's the long-term goal, is really helpful to practitioners. And I was a high school teacher for 15 years, so I come at this primarily from a practice lens. And you can easily get kind of stuck in the weeds of like today's lesson and what are my learning objectives for today, and forget what the long-term goal is. And the truth is that whether, and particularly now I would kind of say this to teachers and educators, but it probably true more broadly, but like that we might think as teachers, we might think our job is to develop knowledge and skills, but we are influencing that, all the rest of that, all the time, very actively. And if we do that unconsciously, we might end up, kind of prioritizing today's learning objectives at the expense of these longer term goals that we ultimately really care about. So like, how does a young person understand themselves in the world, or like what sense are they making of their experience in school? Keeping those goals in mind as really the main priorities are, I think, really helpful to practitioners to just kind of keep their priorities straight and to guide their own actions within their interactions with kids. And so I think it's really important to have that, whether it's a profile of a graduate or some kind of real clear idea of the long term. And then you also asked about measurement. And I am more and more of the mind that the important thing to measure is less, does this kid have this competency, and much more around, are we as a group of adults or an organization providing kids the opportunities to develop these competencies? So I'm much more in favor of measuring environments and contexts and opportunities, and much sketchier on the individual kid level measurement, both because I think the science is not there, the measurement science is not anywhere near where we would want it to be, and that so much of what a young person exhibits of a particular skill or competency is in response to an environment, and in response to how they feel in that environment, and is in response to the relationships they have in that environment. That the idea of competency being something that's just situated inside a kid that we can measure, I just think is wrong-headed.
Well, Camille, if I were in the room with you, I would hug you for that last statement. It's so consistent with what we talk about at the forum and the Weichert Center, and I think really so consistent with the sentiment of sort of the larger sort of youth development field, that we really need to be focused more on making sure we're providing the contexts in which young people feel safe to even demonstrate these competencies, much less practice them and build on them. And we need to understand that interaction. And on that, I'll ask you sort of a last word, which is, we're very explicit in putting the framework out and talking about home, school, and organized activities as sort of three sets of spaces where these kind of developmental settings are. Are they complementary to each other? And what advice, having given us this framework that fits across all of them, what advice do you give us about making the connections better and more explicit?
Yeah, I think that if we start to look at these contexts, which, policy, like if you think of school and family and community and you think of like the people who work in each of those fields and federal and local policy around those things, it's totally separate, right? Like different sets of policies and funding, informs each of those things. But that from a point of view of a young person, they're moving through each of these contexts kind of every day, all the time. And so thinking about how to bring everybody together around the kind of common goal of what we're hoping to develop in young people, I think is like really critical work.
That's great. Well, Camille, we're out of time. I'm going to give it back to Ian for the final words. I have had a great amount of fun in chatting with you, and I hope folks have had fun listening. We've got some of the best questions I think we've ever gotten on Thought Leader Calls, so you've certainly been provocative. So thank you very much, and Ian, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Repeat the thank yous to both Camille and Karen, and for everyone listening today, as well as the Wallace Foundation for both making this research possible, as well as today's webinar session. Would just like to let you know that the next webinar is scheduled, or Thought Leader Conversation is scheduled for Wednesday, October 3rd, and that will feature Nancy Deutsch with Youth Next, the University of Virginia Center to Promote Effective Youth Development. So that's coming up on October 3rd. We will be sending you information about that, as well as the 2 slides from today's presentation, as well as the recording. So please stay tuned for that. You'll get those later this week. And thank you again to everyone for participating in today's conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.